Well, hello, everyone, wherever you happen to be. I want to tell you that I am your host, Michael Hingson, and here we are with Unstoppable Mindset. And we are talking today with Carlos Garcia, who is an attorney. He's a resilience trainer. He's a lot of things. He worked for JAG for a while. Never did see him on the TV show, though, but that's probably good. But anyway, we're going to talk about his life, his world, what he's doing, why he does what he does, and all those sorts of things. So I don't want to give you a lot of information because I want him to provide it all. So we'll just start this way. Carlos, I want to welcome you to Unstoppable Mindset. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Well, I love to always start this way. Why don't you tell us about the early Carlos growing up and some of those things?
So I grew up in a small valley called Simi Valley, California. It was once dubbed the safest city in the country back in 2001. I believe it was from a New York Times article or an LA Times article. I grew up there. My childhood home was there. And my dad, humble beginnings, truck driver. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And was one of those kids that did really well in school growing up. I got good grades. I have that analytical mindset, always trying to be organized and structured. And, I went to school, different schools, and I realized that after a while, I started not being able to, I came to an impasse essentially where I had this feeling of being an imposter that haunted me throughout school, through college, through law school, even as an early attorney. And I realized that this feeling of not being good enough, it was really an amplification of something deeper, which I came to learn was something called fear of judgment or fear of people's opinions. Sometimes there's an acronym for it called FOPO, fear of people's opinions, because there's this quote that I like to talk about from this 20th century psychologist. His name is Alfred Adler. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has an awesome quote that was very eye-opening for me. And he once said that all problems are interpersonal problems. In other words, if there weren't people around you, you wouldn't have this feeling of being inadequate to begin with, right? In other words, it's this fear of being judged. It's this fear of negative evaluation. Being in the spotlight, all eyeballs on you, that creates this fear. And so this was my problem, right? And through time and personal experimentation and research, I needed to figure out a way in terms of how to break from this, because it was really holding me back in many ways. It created inside of me this avoidance, almost a habit of avoidance. It just turned into my personality. I would avoid opportunities wherever I'd be in the spotlight. And so through that, I needed to sort of rebuild myself. Eventually, I created a True Progress Lab to share the insights that I learned and the experiences that I learned, because it's an awful feeling to know that you're ambitious and you're qualified for things, but you just don't have, there's this impasse, this fear that stops you from going after it, right? Getting after it, going after those opportunities. So that's sort of a little bit of my background.
Well, what I'm curious about, I'm always fascinated to talk about fear in so many ways, but why is it that so many people have this fear of other people's opinions? Why is it that we have, and I'm going to deliberately put it this way, but why have we learned that? Because it seems to me it's probably more of a learned behavior than anything else, because we can also unlearn it. But why is it that we tend to all too often face that and we're afraid of what other people think?
Yeah. I think it has a lot to do with our past. It's a learned experience where something happened to us in the past, and then that fear starts to generalize itself, and then it shows up in different ways in our lives. And so what happens is that we generalize that fear, and then because the mind has a way to perceive threats, and often it perceives threats in an exaggerated manner. And so what that does is it keeps us in that safe zone, right? So what I have found in my experience is that I needed to train my mind, specifically my amygdala, right? That fight or flight response. I needed to train that and teach it that there's nothing to fear from the get-go, from the beginning. And that the worst case scenario thought that we're having, that those overthinking thoughts that we're going through, thinking that worst case scenario is going to happen, I needed to violate that prediction, right? There's something in exposure therapy called violating your fear prediction, which means you have to go into the thing that's causing you anxiety and then see if that prediction that you're having before stepping into that event, see if it actually happens. And most of the time it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore you're training your mind and teaching it that there's nothing to fear. And if it does happen, you're still going to survive. You're still going to be breathing. You're going to be okay, right? And that's something that I do at True Progress Lab is using this form of exposure therapy, which teaches people like you have to desensitize yourself to these stressors.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about fear, especially in the last few years, but certainly since September 11th, when I escaped from Tower One. And as I tell people, it took a long time for me to realize that the reason that I was able to function after the plane hit the building was that a mindset kicked in because I knew what to do to escape the buildings, and that a mindset kicked in that caused me to be able to function and not fear everything that comes along. And especially since the pandemic hit, I've been studying a lot more about this and wrote a book entitled Live Like a Guide Dog that talks about fear from the standpoint of what I've learned from working with 8 guide dogs and my wife's service dog. And one of the things that comes up in the discussions in that book that we all often talk about here is that, in fact, most, as you point out, everything that we fear isn't going to come to pass anyway. And the other aspect of that is that we worry about everything under the sun. We are always doing what if about every single thing. And the reality is more than 90% of the things that we what if, we don't really have any control over, but we don't separate ourselves from them. And so the result is that we just continue to worry about them. And I know one of the things that I learned on September 11th is don't worry about what you can't control, focus on what you can. We had no control over the World Trade Center events happening, but we absolutely have control over how we deal with it.
Yeah. And the point about what you mentioned, that when the towers hit, you knew what to do, like this mindset kicked in, right? Mm-hmm. And that made me think about being proactive in terms of we have this habit of waiting for things to happen to us instead of being proactive, taking proactive responsibility. So what that means in practice is what I learned about my life is that I needed to stop letting things happen to me and start taking a more proactive measure in terms of training for the things that are bothering me, or training for things that were causing anxiety inside of me, so that when I needed to do the real thing, you just act, right? Just like you said, your mindset just kicked in, you knew what to do. And that is probably because you've trained that in a proactive manner. And so that when the thing actually happens, you know what to do. And that's what I needed to do. So you need to train outside so that when the real thing happens, you know what to do. You're not waiting for things to happen. You're taking a proactive measure, you know?
Yeah, I understand. Here's a question. Are you familiar with the term in the industry business continuity?
A little bit.
All right.
Tell me more about that. Yeah.
Business continuity, or people who practice it, are the people, they call themselves the what if people. And their job is to really focus on in their businesses that they're working in, or they're contracted to, either way. But in their businesses, their job is to look for different kinds of things that could be emergencies and put in place the systems that will be able to keep the business going if there is an emergency or if those things occur. So they're doing a lot of what ifing, if you will, to say,
Mm,
well, what if this happens? What do we do in the business? What if that happens? And in fact, the company that I do work with, Accessiby, has been doing a fair amount of business continuity. I've not been directly involved with it, but they've been doing it over in Israel because of all the things that are going on over there. And
yeah,
what if there are attacks? What if servers go down? How does the
right.
company keep going in the U.S. and so on? What's really interesting to me is these people, and I'd be curious to get your take on it, but these people do that, but they're clearly not fearful. They're
Mm,
they're anticipating and putting things in place, but I've not ever heard that they're afraid. Why is
mm.
that? Why is that?
Yeah, that makes me think about this quote from Seneca, who's a Stoic philosopher, and he said, um, "The man lost his children. You too can lose yours. The man who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive." So it's about visualizing worst case scenarios, and even taking a next step, which is more advanced, is living out the worst case scenario. It kind of goes in line with desensitizing yourself to the stressor, right? By envisioning it, because as you may know, when you visualize things, it's almost like doing an actual rep, right? And
Right.
so when you visualize it, when you think about it, you take away its complete power over you because you've thought about the situation, and then you've actually maybe taken the next step of actually formulating an action plan about it. So you're less anxious about, okay, what if this happens? Then I could actually maybe have an action plan in terms of what I need to do next, you know? So it's a way to create distance, I think, between the fear and what may or may not happen, right? Um,
Well, yeah, and the reality is that with most people, we what if everything to death, but we're doing it out of
yeah,
fear as opposed to out
right.
of planning. And as you point out, when you're doing it as part of creating a plan, or
Yes,
as part of truly anticipating potential, then you've taken away the stressor part.
right. Yeah, there is a big difference between just saying what if and having those scatter thoughts and replaying the what ifs in your mind versus, okay, this is a negative or potentially worst case scenario thought I'm having. So is it true? What can I do to plan? You know, we have there's a technique we call rational optimism, which is from this psychologist. He's known as the father of psychology. His name is Martin Seligman. You may have heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
What he calls a learned optimism, and essentially is putting your thoughts that you're having in your mind, putting them against the wall and acting like an objective fact-finding detective and trying to figure out, okay, are these thoughts that I'm having, are they actually true? Like, what's the evidence for these thoughts? What's the evidence against these thoughts, right? And it's kind of to your point about the, worst case scenario. Okay, is this worst case scenario, could it actually happen? Or am I just really exaggerating, And being intentional about that, I think, is important. It's difficult because when you're in the heat of passion, your mind is going nuts, and you need to have those techniques in your back pocket to kind of come down to reality and say, okay, what am I exaggerating here? Am I thinking things that are just not true?
Right. Well, clearly, I think no one ever thought, or not enough to put a plan into action, but no one ever thought that somebody would fly a large aircraft totally loaded with jet fuel into a building of the World Trade Center or into the Pentagon,
Mm.
until somebody did. And so, was that a failure on someone's part? I'm not sure that it is or was, but also, having seen it happen, it also then created, I think, more of a mindset to work harder to try to anticipate potentialities.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true because I mean I can't imagine being this in that situation that you were in, but yeah, more of a reason to really think outside the box in terms of what could potentially happen, right? And again, I think it goes back to just being proactive and being intentional about those things.
We spend so much time teaching people to fear so many things and fear them in a negative way. I don't have any problem with people having a fear, a respectful fear of one thing or another. But the issue is if you fear it and let that fear overwhelm you, or like I like to say, blind you, that's a different situation.
Mm,
I think there's no problem with the point of being afraid or having a fear. I don't want to say being afraid, but having a fear of something, but you use that fear to help you focus and to help you be more aware of what goes on around you. That's a whole
yeah.
different animal than just being afraid and then letting that fear overwhelm you.
Yeah, for sure. I think some nerves are good, some fear is good because you need it to perform too. It's positive energy. If you see it as positive energy, then you can use it to your advantage. But if you see fear in a way that makes you defensive and you see it as a threat, then it's not positive energy. Now you're in that fight or flight mode, and you're thinking, okay, I need to protect my ego or I need to protect myself against this perceived threat. And there's a big difference in terms of how you see that, how you see fear. If you see fear as a good thing, like this mindset, stress is enhancing mindset. If you see stress as a good thing in terms of using it to your advantage to perform better, then you're going to perform better. If you see it as a negative thing, then you're going to try to make it go away. But I think you shouldn't try to make stress or anxiety go away, because I think you should get stronger despite the stress, because
Right.
you're going to get stronger, right? There are always going to be problems and challenges, and as you grow, you're going to build businesses, or you're going to have more difficult conversations, you're going to be exposed to more things. You can't hide under a rock, right? You're going to be, the more exposed you are to things, the more potential stress there's going to be. So making stress go away is not a smart strategy for me. I think I need to become comfortable in the uncomfortable. We either get stronger or we don't get stronger.
Right. Well, and I certainly don't expect everyone to become Mr. Spock and have no emotions.
Sure.
We're not going to be Vulcans, but I think that we all can learn to be a whole lot more analytical. We all can learn to exercise a lot more control over our lives. And again, that's an area where we do have control. We may not be able to control what happens to us. Some unexpected thing might occur, like anything from losing a job to um, a fire that comes in your neighborhood or whatever. But we do have control again over how we deal with it, and I think that's the big issue. How do we get people in general to become more analytical, to become more aware that they have to really study themselves and teach
Mm,
themselves how to deal with fear? Because I don't think, well, we don't teach that generally, and kids don't grow up learning that. And one
yeah.
of my favorite examples of fear and all that is I listen to the weather forecast every day. And my gosh, those people, those weather people are never satisfied. It's too hot. It's too cold. Well, it's a good day today, but there are clouds. There are always buts. There are always things that cause people to react. And uh, that doesn't contribute to us learning anything positive or productive to overcome fear.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always on the news, you turn on the news and it's always this FOMO, fear of missing out, or this mind, just try, because it's such a good marketing technique to keep you in this, this is what's going to happen if you don't do this. This is what's going to happen if you do that, right? And I think it takes studying a little bit of marketing to see what's trying to deceive you and what's not trying to deceive you. I think I've learned that over the years and running my business is seeing when people are trying to scare you and when they're when they're not trying to scare you. But on another point that you said about how can we become more analytical with fear, I think it starts with being in simmering in the fear, in the anxiety, and again teaching your mind that it's okay, like it's gonna be okay, right? Because if you can't get to a certain, if you're say you're different levels of discomfort, say one being the lowest stress discomfort level and 10 being, you're panicking basically, right? If you're going into a situation and you're like at a level 7 or 6, anything above 6, you're not going to really be able to use that thinking part of your brain because you're going to be in that fight or flight mode. So you first need to relax yourself. You need to like quiet your amygdala, that part of the brain that is making you all tense and defensive. And then once you do that, then you allow room to, okay, now I can maybe start thinking about thinking on my feet. Now I can maybe start being creative, using my intuition, smiling, right? Showing up as my best self. But you can't do any of that if you're all stressed out, right? If your discomfort level is so high. So I would say the first thing is learning how to become comfortable in the uncomfortable, and then you can start to whip out some nice, interesting, intelligent ideas with your
Yeah.
mind, right?
How do you teach people to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work backwards. So first we identify what is the thing that's causing the anxiety, because we found that it's always the specific situation, but not so much the situation. It's the fact that you're in the spotlight, that there are eyeballs on you, right? So when there are eyeballs on you, it can be in different situations. Maybe it could be at networking events. Maybe it could be during delivery presentations or deliveries. It could be doing like an investor pitch before, at Shark Tank, for example, or being in a meeting with senior leadership and having to speak up and there being potential conflict. So these could be potential situations. Then you got to work backwards and see, okay, how can I train for these situations outside of the workplace where the stakes are not so high, and train for that with realistic stress levels so that I feel stress and I know what it's like to be in these situations. And then so that when I become comfortable, then I can take that new experience and wisdom into the workplace. I know what it's like to be in those situations. I know how to manage my thoughts and emotions. I know what to tell myself. I know how to communicate. You take all that knowledge into the workplace so that you can shine in the workplace, right? It's just like Olympians or the special forces community, Navy SEALs, special forces in the Army. That's how they train. Their training is much more difficult than the actual mission. And that's intentional. That's on purpose so that when it's time to shine, they can shine. Same approach we take. You train hard outside of the workplace so that you bring that newly built confidence into the workplace. You don't want to do that necessarily in the workplace,
Right.
because the stakes are higher. You need to perform. Your bosses may not be as empathetic or understanding. There may not be that psychological safety that people are looking for. You can't wait for psychological safety to show up for you to then shine. You have to learn to shine in the absence of that.
One of the things that I've advocated and advocate and live like a guide dog is it would be very helpful to take time at the end of the day. We need to learn to be more introspective anyway, but to take the time when you're starting to fall asleep, when you get in bed, to think about what happened today, what worked, what didn't work. I never use the term failure because I don't think that negative connotation really helps, but you can talk about what worked, what didn't work. Why didn't something work like you expected it to? And then
Mm.
carry that to what were you afraid of? What caused you fear? And what can you do to overcome that. Or even with what worked really well today and how might I even make it better next time? But if you really ask yourself those questions, I also think that most all of us truly have the answers within us if we would but learn to listen for them.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Michael. We need to create that space and that time after situations or events or experiences where we can actually reflect and ask those important questions. Because it's about, okay, what am I asking myself the right questions so that I can then it starts triggering some thoughts and it starts triggering some reflection in terms of, okay, am I actually learning something out of this experience, you know? And like you said, I mean, it's not failure. You know, in the military, we have something called AAR, or after action review.
Right.
Or after every training mission or actual mission, we ask very similar questions to the questions you just asked. You know, what went well? What didn't go so well? What could we do better next time? Simple questions, but very effective, right?
Yeah.
You got to keep things simple. Keep it simple, silly, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it's not failure. It's learning. There's no progress until, you know, I had to learn how to fail. And learning how to fail is understanding that, like you said, you know, there is no failure, right? Failure is about learning, not keeping in a persona or keeping an image or wanting certain individuals to think of you in a certain limelight or way, right? It's about becoming comfortable with failure, and you know, you'll have less hesitation with it. You'll start taking more imperfect action because you understand that, you know, failure is learning, not about proving things to people, you know. And I think, you know, I've had a hard time with that, is trying to, and it's so exhausting too, right? When you're trying to uphold an image of yourself, it's exhausting because you shouldn't focus on upholding an image of a certain image of yourself. You should focus on learning. You should focus on making mistakes and learning from them, like you said, and then asking those important questions, right? So that you can reflect on that.
One of the things that I used to say all the time, and I've talked about it here on the podcast before, but is I used to say I'm my own worst critic when I would record my speeches and I want to listen to them to hear what I did and didn't do and so on. And I always made the comment as justification for it, I'm my own worst critic. And only in the last couple of years, only in the last year actually, have I learned that's not the right thing to say because it's such a negative thing, but rather I'm my own best teacher, because in reality, I'm the only person who can truly teach me anything and get me to learn. Other people can provide information, but only I can truly assimilate it. And the reality is I'm my own best teacher. You're your own best teacher. And when we work to truly learn from our experiences, we'll move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. We tend to be really hard on ourselves, right? And, you know, like you, I found that I needed to learn how to be kinder to myself and not picking everything apart and having this perfectionist mindset, right? Often we say, oh, we're you know, we take pride in being a perfectionist, but often I found that perfectionism is just a disguise for going back to fear of being judged, right? And so what happens is that we over prepare, we overthink, we fear making mistakes, and we call ourselves a perfectionist, but perfectionism is really a disguise for that. So I think being kinder, I think is
and there are times to beat up on yourself if you don't learn from the mistake. If you go and do the same thing over and over again, then you somewhere along the line have to slap yourself upside the head and go, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Because I know it's not right. Why am I continuing to do it? I'm not catching on to something here.
Yeah. No, that's true for sure. Yeah, you have to slap yourself if you keep
Yeah.
making the same mistakes. Yeah.
If you just don't change.
Right.
And again, it's all about becoming wise enough to make changes when there's a need to do it, to not only eliminate the fear, but to be able to progress and do something in a much more positive way. And
Right.
I think every time we figure that out and we do it, we should celebrate, and absolutely should celebrate it. We should be joyful that we figured this
Yeah.
out. We don't make that mistake again. We won't make that mistake again, or rather than a mistake, we just won't operate that way. We're going to change the way we do it.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point of celebrating your tiny wins and rewarding yourself, even not, taking yourself out to a restaurant, but just making a note of it. Almost, I actually have a log for things that I have overcome. I call it my proof list. And it's just a simple log with dates of events of things that I overcame or I succeeded in. And they could be small things, like doing a presentation in front of this group of people, or, winning this competition, or even participating in a competition. And, reviewing that and reminding my mind that, okay, I've done these things, I should have reasons to celebrate, because the mind is so fragile. We forget things, we're so busy with work, we're busy doing other things, that if you don't schedule a time to remind yourself of the things that you overcame, and the things that your accomplishments, they're just going to fizzle away. They're going to fizzle out. You're going to forget about them. So I think that's something I've been doing for the past several years.
Well, you went through a period where you had a lot of these fears and so on. And what really caused you to change and grow and take a
Yeah.
different tack to what you were doing? Because I know you were a JAG and a lawyer
Yeah.
for 10 years and so on, but yet some of these fears were existing in your mind. What did you do?
Yeah. It was an accumulation, I think, of things, and a time that I took to reflect on my life and realize that I was just avoiding. There were great opportunities that I was being given, and I was avoiding those opportunities, or making illogical excuses for why I shouldn't stretch myself or take advantage of them. Work related, non-work related. And, I just said enough was enough. I can't be doing this, and I started taking a stand. I think it starts with reflection, realizing there's a problem.
Mhm.
And then the second thing for me was getting a little bit angry, a little bit angry, a little bit aggressive, because I think anger is a very powerful emotion if you can channel it in the right way. And for me, it was anger at myself, in terms of why I was missing out on these things. And then I realized, okay, things needed to change. And I started, like many other people they start reading, they start researching, they start experimenting with things. I started doing a lot of physical training. I learned that moving the body and stressing the body is a powerful way to learn how to manage your thoughts and your negative emotions. Because if you think about it, what are the things that ultimately derail us? There are emotions that get the best of us: fear, anxiety, stress, frustration, boredom, anger. These things, they make us avoid opportunities, or they make us quit early. And I learned that stressing my body through rigorous physical exercise, whether it's ultra endurance running or combat sports, these things, or these activities are vehicles, or arenas where you can intentionally train your mind to learn
Mhm.
how to, i.e., learn how to manage those negative thoughts and emotions, so that they don't control your decision making, so they don't control your actions, so that you're taking the right actions despite not feeling a certain way, right?
Yeah.
Because I had a bad habit of letting my emotions dictate my actions. I don't feel like doing this today, or I'm too scared to do that, and therefore not doing it, right? Versus, okay, I feel this way, but in spite of feeling this way, I'm still going to do it. And, I learned that through learning
Yeah.
techniques on how to manage my thoughts and emotions, right? And then the other important piece was the mental conditioning, like the example I just gave you with recreating your environment, the things that cause you anxiety, and then replicating that outside the workplace, and then bringing that new experience and confidence into the workplace.
Right.
Things like that.
I know it's me, but I am so amazed that one of the top fears that people have is a fear of public speaking. And I still don't understand really why. Of course, I'm coming from a place of knowledge. And I know, for example, that audiences really want speakers to succeed unless they truly view you as the enemy, which they do with politicians and things like that. But mostly, especially in the speaking arena, I think audiences want people to succeed. They want to hear what you have to say, but so many people are afraid to go out and speak.
Yeah. 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 And in my experience, it's a fear of being humiliated, a fear of failing in public, right? We have these worst case scenario thoughts that we're going to mess up, and that controls our thinking.
Yeah,
And so what I found is that you need to live out your worst case scenario and realize that it's going to be okay, right? It's going to be okay. And then practice. So we have something called intentional embarrassment or intentional humiliation, where you put yourself in potentially embarrassing situations where you feel that emotion, because you need to become desensitized to it. You need to expose yourself to it, because it's going to happen. You don't want it to happen when you're speaking in front of a group of people, right? You want to know what it feels like, so that when you're in front of a group of people, you're not gonna break. You're gonna be like, okay, I felt this before, not a big deal. I know how to reroute myself and get back on track, right? And it also comes from this notion of taking yourself too seriously, right?
yeah.
Are you there to put up a image of to uphold an image of yourself, or are you there to provide value to people, right? Before you step on stage, like, what's your purpose, right? If you're thinking about you, and not about, okay, how can I contribute? How can I help people? How can I bring value? That's going to mess you up too, right?
Sure.
So being so externally focused instead of, or not externally focused, but being so internally focused instead of focusing on, how you can contribute, right?
And the other part of it is that you may, even on stage, mess up. And
Yeah.
again, if it happens, what do you do about it? I've been pretty fortunate to be able to speak and have not really had a lot of problems with that. But I know that, having worked in radio for a while and made a couple of mistakes on the air,
Yeah.
the best thing to do is to laugh at yourself and learn to move forward. And I've observed a number of people. I think probably one of the best examples is Johnny Carson, who for many years on The Tonight Show did all sorts of things, including, I know, sometimes messed up, and made fun of himself and knew how to move on and turn what was potentially an embarrassing situation into a positive thing and bring the audience with you. And I think those are all preparations that we all need to learn to make.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. Laughing at yourself and owning your mistakes, you're owning your flaws. It's so powerful, because you're not letting the audience do it. You're doing it yourself, right? You're allowing yourself to make mistakes and laugh at yourself. And that has a way of taking, owning it, right?
Yeah.
It has a way of creating power in you and taking the power away from other people who may make fun of you. They can't make fun of you because you've already made fun of yourself, right? And
Or you join them.
or you join them. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's a great strategy. Laugh at
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, and that gets back to what you were saying earlier. Don't take yourself too seriously, and all too often we do that. But the reality is, and as I tell people who come on this podcast, the only rule is you got to have fun. And I want people to have fun. I want people to have interesting content to talk about. We certainly do here, But at the
Yeah.
same time, I want people to enjoy themselves and to relax and to have fun,
Yeah.
because it's so much more important to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm a recovering stiff, take myself too seriously kind of guy. I'm still recovering from that, and in my profession too, it can get very stiff. Attorneys can get very stiff, and that's one of the causes of burnout, because you're trying to uphold this image, and so you're overworking yourself to the ground, or you're taking more work than you should be taking. And what happens is you burn out, right?
Yeah.
From this core concept of wanting people to like you, not
Yeah.
wanting to be disliked, not wanting to be judged by people pleasing, right? It all comes from that.
Right. Well, you were a JAG officer and so on. How long did you do that?
Yeah, so I commissioned in 2016 of August 2016, into the Army JAG Corps Reserves. So we have an active component and a reserve component. So I commissioned as an officer into the reserve component, but I've been on active duty. I've gone on active duty tours. I've mobilized in different places in the U.S. and overseas as well. So I've been doing it since 2016, and most recently. So you have different positions in the JAG Corps, and I work in TDS, which is stands for Trial Defense Service. So it's defending soldiers who've been charged with adverse actions, charged with crimes, and I represent them essentially on the military side. So it's a lot of fun. It's very fulfilling. I love it. I've been doing TDS, and you can do different areas of law in the JAG Corps, but I love TDS. I love the representing the underdog, because it is the underdog. It's the government, the prosecutor on the military side. You have the paralegals on the military side. You have all the personnel on the military side and the military, right, against the TDS lawyer, JAG lawyer, and the client and the resources that we have. And I like this idea of representing the underdog. It's very fulfilling for me. So
I assume you win some cases.
yeah, I win some cases, I lose some cases. It just depends on what the evidence is. But it really is a lot about humanizing the soldier, learning about who they are as a person, as an individual, where they come from in the world, what are their aspirations in the military, why they joined the military, what happened, really humanizing and providing context, because the judges, they don't really know the individual, they just see a piece of paper and a charge, right? And so it's our job to paint a picture of who this person is, that he's a human. Everybody makes mistakes. Leaders make mistakes. Non-leaders make mistakes. So I love it.
So what is True Progress Labs? Let's get to that.
True Progress Lab is the organization I started some years ago, as I was saying, and I help people learn how to become calm in situations that stress themselves, or they get stressed out. And then after they learn how to be calm in those situations, they can then become bold in those situations and get after it, right? Seize the opportunities that they want to seize. And I help both individuals, and I go into organizations and do workshops, resilience and leadership workshops. And it comes a lot from my personal experience. And then when I became an Army resilience trainer, on the Army side, where I coach leaders and soldiers, JAG attorneys on resilience, very similar topics on how to manage stress and build resilience in the workplace. It's a program we have in the Army that was built several years ago. It's a train the trainer program. So soldiers such as myself, they get trained in resilience training, and then we go back into our units and we train those concepts and principles in our respective units and help other soldiers, other leaders develop resilience. And a lot of what I learned there, I infused into True Progress Lab, because I realized, like myself, I liked a lot of resilience. And the Army Resilience Program taught me a lot. And it's definitely something that I never thought I would be doing, because I went to law school, and now I'm a resilience coach. Right.
So what does that mean exactly? What is resilience, and how do you teach it?
Yeah, resilience is, I define as the ability to bounce back, but not just bounce back and not just be flexible, right, in spite of challenge or adversity or uncertainty, but be able to thrive despite it, right? To be able to use adversity as a stepping stone to get stronger and go after those big opportunities. And the way we train it is very similar to what I described some moments ago, which is about creating identity expanding experiences that build the kind of evidence and proof that you are that person that can get through these difficult feats, that you can get through these difficult challenges. And it's about stacking those pieces of evidence so that you can actually go after those big opportunities, so that you can actually shoot high, so that you can actually shine when it counts in the workplace.
Yeah.
And we do that through the physical conditioning and the mental conditioning that I was describing earlier. And learning how to manage your thoughts, like we give these techniques on managing your emotions and thoughts, these emotion and nervous system regulation protocols, because you need that, right? Because you're gonna fail. You're gonna, it's not all roses. You're gonna go through these experiences and challenges, and you're gonna fail. But that's what makes you resilient, right? Is learning how to get back up despite the failure. And if you don't know how to do that, you're going to stay on the ground. You don't want to stay on the ground. You want to be able to know what to tell yourself so that you can get back and try again, right?
And of course, it's all about, it's not so much the whole word failure as it is learning to deal with mistakes. But you do have to learn resilience. You do have to learn to bounce back. And we all should do more of that than we probably do. And I realize there are a lot of different kinds of personalities, and some people will do it more easily than others. But again, there's so much that we don't train, for example, children growing up, that it would be so good if we spent more time doing some of these things with our kids. But unfortunately, we didn't learn it either, and that doesn't help the process.
For sure, yeah. There is a concept that sticks with me from this psychologist. Her name is Angela Duckworth, and she has a concept that she describes. She calls people who haven't really learned how to fail fragile perfects. And basically, it's this notion that you have really smart kids or people who are very talented, and they're used to winning all the time. But when they fail, they don't know how to fail because they've never failed. And so when they fail, they have a difficult time getting back up. Right. And so that's why, I'm all about being proactive in terms of creating those stretch experiences or those challenging experiences for yourself, so that you callous your mind, so that you learn how to be, because you're going to have failures in life, right? And if you're not used to failing, it's going to be very difficult for you. You're going to have all these Ivy League degrees, but you're not going to know what to do when things get bad.
Yeah, you're not going to learn what the real world is truly all about.
Correct. And it's going to get bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you coach people all over the world. You don't just coach people in the military.
No, on the military side, I'm an Army resilience trainer, so that's only the military. But True Progress Lab is civilian, and it's in the U.S. So we do one-on-one coaching, but I also do workshops inside of organizations, law firms, and tech companies, on resilience, on how to build resilience, and some leadership training as well. But a lot of it has to do with resilience.
So what are your clients' biggest struggles when they come to you?
There are a lot of symptoms that we find, and it depends highly on who they are. If it's a leadership team or if it's like a smaller team, but it runs the gamut. But the common themes that we've seen are dysfunctions within teams. Dysfunctions within teams, that's number one. And number two is not knowing how to handle the pressure. And as a result of not knowing how to handle the pressure, there are a lot of mistakes that are being made. There's a lot of blaming that is being done, and that causes more team dysfunction. So it's almost like a vicious cycle, right? So one of the things I like to do is, because when I do these workshops, people want to see, okay, how do we build a good team? How do I become a good leader? But it always starts with, we find a common theme starting with the person, right? It's the leader themselves, in terms of not knowing how to manage themselves, their internal state, because they want to handle teams, but first they need to learn how to handle themselves. So we like to start with personal resilience. Like, how do you manage yourself? How do you manage your thoughts, your emotions, your nervous system when you're in high stress situations? And then from there, we start, okay, now I can think a little clearer. Now let me see more objectively what is actually going on here. Because we go in there and people are thinking something, but then they realize that after they learn how to manage their thoughts and emotion, their nervous system, they have a clear picture of what's actually going on. So that's very eye-opening.
One of the things that you said part of it already, but you say get calm, get bold, and get after it. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, get calm is about learning how to manage your thoughts and emotions and nervous system when you're in a high pressure situation. Becoming comfortable in the uncomfortable, becoming okay with having eyeballs on you. Like you said earlier, right? When you're doing your presentations, you've learned not to really have a problem with it, right? Because after you learn that, then you can actually create room to start taking risks, to start being bolder. You can't be bold if you're not having the foundation of competence and confidence. Once you have that foundation and you're calm when it's stressful, then you allow the space for risk taking, for smiling more, for not seeing challenges as threats, but seeing challenges as challenges. And after you do that, then you can actually get after it. Then you can actually go after those bigger opportunities. It works in that order, I have found in my experience, not the other way around.
How do you help people learn that process? Get calm, get bold, get after it.
Yeah, so we do it through the physical conditioning. We do it through the mental conditioning. We do it through learning more about what it is that you want. So something that I learned years ago from this psychologist, his name is, I can't think of him, but he wrote a book, Leading with Character. Jim, I can't remember, his first name is Jim Lauer. And he wrote a book called Leading with Character. And in that book, I learned that every leader, every person should have an ethos, a personal constitution. And what that is just like a country has their own constitution, each human being should have their constitution of values, of clarity on their mission, clarity on their vision, clarity on what they want their legacy to be about. Once you have that, you have more clarity on what you need to be focusing on, what you need to be prioritizing. And I have found that has really helped me stay focused on the right things and not let the external world modify my decisions and actions. That's a key component of helping people get calm and bold and get after it, because you need to know what you need to be focusing on in the first place, right? And then stacking that evidence, stacking that proof that you are that person, right? By doing these hard things, these identity expanding experiences. And then once you have expanded that level of comfort in the uncomfortable, then you are allowed to then seize those opportunities, take advantage of those opportunities, because you've created that, you've built that.
Right. Well, and again, I think one of the really important parts of all of this to keep your own sanity and so on is that you don't take yourself too seriously, and you really work to work with people and help people, but you've learned not to stress out, and you've learned that it's important for you to set a role model and an example for the people you work with and that you coach.
Yes, because we take part of not taking yourself so seriously, as you may know, Michael, is not relying on job titles, not relying on status symbols, not relying on color belts, because we're not just one job title. We're not our job. We're not a status. We are a growing organism. We're always growing. We're always learning. And so if you think in that way, yeah, you're not going to take yourself too seriously, right? You're not going to fix yourself on identifying yourself as this persona or that job title or that leadership position, because you're in a constant state of growth and learning. And with that mindset comes a mindset of knowing that you shouldn't be so stiff and take yourself so seriously, because it's not going to help you get outside your comfort zone when you need to get out your comfort zone and grow, right?
Right. What do you say to someone who says, well, I really don't need to learn anymore. I really know all that I need to know.
Yeah.
I bet you've heard that before.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you have people like that who don't really want to stretch themselves, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, you don't need to read more books if you don't want to. You don't need to stretch yourself, but there's going to be an opportunity that's going to show up, and you're going to not know how to take advantage of it because you decided to have that mindset, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I found that I need to be always stretching myself, because your comfort zone is like a drug. You get attached to it, you get addicted to it, and it's very hard to let go of your comfort zone, I have found, and I was like that for years. It was very difficult for me. So I had to create momentum and build a routine of continuous friction in my life, so that I learned to be comfortable when there's discomfort. Because if you're always too comfortable, then it becomes more difficult to jump out and seize that opportunity, because you've been in your comfort zones for so long that you don't want to do it. Your instinct is to avoid or to hesitate, right?
Right. What would you say to someone who comes to you and says, I'm just continuing to have problems. I've tried all sorts of things and I've just given up. What do you say to them?
You've given up. Okay. Well, I can't help you if you've given up, but I would say you have to stress test yourself. You have to, learning knowledge doesn't really do much. You have calming techniques doesn't really do much if you're not creating the type of identity expanding experiences that teaches you about yourself, about what you're made of, right? That's why people do all these crazy things. That's why people run 200 miles, because it's a way of learning it's a way of learning about yourself. And that's how you stop letting fear control you. How you get bold and get after it is by creating experiences, not just reading books about it, and learning about it, but doing it, right? So there's this I just want to say there's this quote from this Stoic philosopher. His name is Musonius Rufus, and he gives two examples that stuck with me to illustrate this point. He gives the example of two doctors, right? One of them, talks about medical matters, but has never really actually cared for sick people. The other doctor, though, isn't really able to talk about medical stuff, and he stumbles even when he tries to talk, but he's cared for sick people, right? Who would you rather choose as your doctor? And he gives another example of sailing. One has sailed many times, and the other knows the theory behind sailing, right? He's just read books about it, but he's never really sailed before. He's never been in the sea sailing boats. Which would you rather choose, right, as your pilot? So,
Yeah.
in other words, you don't acquire strength, courage, mental toughness, which you need to build that resilience, right? By realizing that things that people fear shouldn't be feared, but by practicing being fearless
Yeah.
towards them, right?
Well, I know we had a guest on the podcast not too awfully long ago who made a very interesting point, and that is that you can read a lot of things in books and you can get a lot of information. And we were talking about and the whole concept that I had of the mindset kicked in on September 11th. And his point was, but that's different than actually having the knowledge, because the knowledge is really the power. And the knowledge allowed the mindset to kick in and for you to be able to function. And I thought about that, and he's absolutely right. Information is lovely only to a point. But if you can't truly internalize it and make it work, then it's not going to.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you have to apply that knowledge in pressure situations, because you're not going to remember it if you haven't practiced it, right? It's like a martial artist who watches videos of kicks, but if he's never really tried the kicks when it's time to fight, it's not going to just suddenly pop up in his mind, right? You need to internalize it, like you just said.
Well, if people want to reach out to you, and I hope they will, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I have a website, trueprogresslab.com. And then if anybody has any questions, you can email me at hello@trueprogresslab.com. And then I'm also on social media. My social media handle on most social media platforms is True Progress Lab.
So it's singular lab, right? trueprogresslab.com.
Correct.
And social media handle is True Progress Lab. Well, that's great. Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to meet your daughter. We had an introductory call, folks, and when we did, she was in the room, so it was kind of fun to talk to her.
Yeah,
she's 2, which she's
2.
very, very vocal. Well, I want to thank you for being here. This has absolutely been a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we got to do all of this. And I hope people will reach out to you. I certainly would appreciate it if all of you out there observing the podcast would reach out to me. I'd love to know your thoughts, love to know what you think of today. You can reach me at Michael, Michaelhi, at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com. Love to hear your thoughts, love to get your opinions. And wherever you're watching or listening to the podcast, I hope that you will give us a 5-star review on the podcast. We value your ratings and your thoughts very highly, so please do that. In addition, if you know anyone who you think ought to be a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, would love to have introductions. So please have them reach out to me. That would be great. And Carlos, you as well. If you've got any thoughts, I'm always looking for people and more people to meet and so on. But this has been really wonderful. And I want to thank you once more for being here and being with us for the last hour.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure.